morning. Welcome to this seminar. This is the third in our series of 3 about the Integrated National Transport Strategy. So in the first 2, we talked about smart data and national pricing. What's really interesting today is we're going broader. So we're actually going to look at how different policies interact. We've got some fantastic speakers. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we're going to hear from various perspectives. I've been able to see some of the slides in advance and they look fantastic. So I think you've got some really interesting speakers on today. So I'm going to start by handing you over to Sarah Jones from Public Health Wales, who's going to talk to us specifically about what's going on in Wales.
So I'm Dr. Sarah Jones and I'm a consultant in environmental public health with Public Health Wales, and I've got an ongoing interest in transport and transport issues. Next slide, please. This presentation is hopefully with a bit of wit, entitled Back to the Future, and I hope the reasons why I refer to it that way will become clear as I speak. Next slide, please. So we've had roads for about 12,000 years, and often when you get involved in the debate around transport and health, actually it almost feels as if this is something very new. But the reality is 12,000 years of roads have brought with them many advantages. They've really facilitated trade, development and communication. They've also brought with them many disadvantages, most notably from a health perspective, illness and disease. And if we take the chart on the right there, the blue part of the chart is the proportion of time for which we had no cars on our roads. And the tiny red bar at the top is the proportion of time for which we had cars on our roads. And I think it's the reality that in that blue period, yes, we saw both advantages and disadvantages of roads, but it's really only in the red period of time, since cars have appeared on our roads, that the disadvantages of cars have actually increased to epidemic levels. Next slide, please. Now, 120, 130 years ago, when cars first started to emerge, actually the road space was viewed as a space in which everybody was permitted to be. There was no hierarchy. All road users had equal rights to be in that space, and all the road users within that space had a responsibility to look after other road users within the space. And you can see from looking at the pictures there, yes, you've got a lot of cars in the one side. On the other side, you've got a mix of a variety of vehicles and people, all of whom are having to be considerate of others. Next slide, please. But what happened when cars started to emerge on the road was that they started to be afforded a greater priority. They were given a greater importance in the hierarchy. And this was marked first and foremost by a change in language. We know that when cars first appeared on our roads, deaths that were associated with those cars that were referred to as motor vehicle killings. But actually this was felt to be unpalatable to people, and the term accident was born. And I think that's probably been one of the most harmful changes in our language that we've ever seen, because our accident gave the impression that we couldn't do anything about what was happening. It was all okay because it was random and didn't really matter. We saw changes in legislation that actually made it illegal for pedestrians to cross the road in certain places. Jaywalking became common terminology, and it really sought to enforce that perspective that cars were more important than anyone else. And now we found ourselves in a situation where actually killing somebody with a car is referred to as being okay in a way that doing so with a gun isn't. And that's also then been skewed in our understanding of risk, because we've become very exercised about situations that are relatively low risk and actually ignore the big risk that's associated with motor vehicles. Next slide, please. So what does road traffic do for us? Well, it brings with it air pollution. It increases social isolation and loneliness. It encourages physical activity. It creates noise, which has a health harm that's of a similar magnitude to air pollution. It exacerbates inequalities and it causes road traffic injuries. As I said earlier, the harms associated with road traffic are at epidemic levels. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about these in Wales? Well, we've got a number of approaches in Wales which are moving us towards a less harmful road traffic environment. In 2015, the Welsh Government introduced the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which has 7 goals associated with it, all of which force the public sector to consider future generations in their actions. Health is one of them, but we also have resilience, equality, cohesive communities, a thriving and vibrant culture, globally responsible, prosperous and resilient. And the introduction on 17th September 2023 of a default 20 miles an hour speed limit was associated very much with delivering on all 7 of these well-being goals, and the chart on the top right there sets out how the reduction in the speed limit to 20 miles an hour helps deliver on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It also helps to deliver on the commitment in Wales to consider health in all policies, because the reality from my perspective is that transport policy is in fact health policy. Everything that we do in our transport environment affects our health, and conversely, our health affects our ability to travel and the way in which we can travel. So we have to consider our transport choices and the choices that are available to us when we travel, when we are considering transport policy. And Wales is taking the right steps. It's moving along a path that's going to take a good while to reach a conclusion that brings us back to where we were 130 years ago, but it's most definitely along the right path. We've also in Wales adopted the sustainable transport hierarchy as part of our planning policy. So rather than cars being seen as being at the top of the transport hierarchy, they're now being moved to the bottom of the transport hierarchy, with active travel and public transport being put higher up in the chain. These are all really, really important steps, but it does take time for them to become embedded, for the real churn in people's thinking to move over, and actually for the big gains and the big outcomes to be seen. Next slide, please. And we have to do this because actually a transport system that's based on cars is really, really expensive. We can't afford to keep financing a transport system that's based on cars, because we know there's evidence shows that actually walking saves us money. As an economy, walking saves us money. Biking, cycling saves us money as an economy. Using public transport is a bit more costly, but it's still a lot cheaper than cars, because we don't often, in our own consideration of the economy, we automatically think that fast is good, rather than realizing that road space costs us an awful lot of money, that for every lane you build, you need to build another lane and another lane and another lane. And no matter how our cars are powered, actually they're still cars. They are still going to bring with us the harms that are associated with roads and cars on our road space. Next slide, please. So where do I think the future of transport is? Well, I think it's about the sustainable transport hierarchy. I think electric bikes, and when I say electric bikes, I mean the legal electric bikes, the bikes that you have to pedal rather than the press button electric bikes, are very much part of the future. Walking and cycling infrastructure and investment in this, making it safe for women, for small children, for older people, and public transport is where we need to be. Autonomous vehicles, coming up with increasingly sophisticated approaches to fueling vehicles, hyperloops and billionaires in space is not going to be what's going to bring about big gains in transport and health for the entire population. Next slide, please. And none of this is new. We started out with a shot of Doc, Marty and Jennifer from Back to the Future at the beginning. And John F. Kennedy actually said all of this 60 years ago. None of this is new. We just need to now start moving more rapidly towards a transport system that perhaps conversely to what I've just said actually needs slowing down a little. Thanks for your time all.
But I'm actually going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk to us from an urban planning perspective.
Thank you so much, Sally. Actually, more from a health perspective. I'm working for the Barcelona Institute for Global Health. Next. So what I try to talk a little bit about is the link between urban planning, mobility, and health. And as what I said, I'm coming from a public health perspective. I'm looking particularly at the burden related to our current systems. Next. So we have a number of different challenges at the moment in our society. First of all, we know that many people are overweight or obese, more than half the people nowadays. We've got an aging population that's more susceptible to dementia. Also, we have mental health problems. And also, we know that most people don't get enough physical activity. And actually, these things are linked. I mean, we know that physical activity is an important determinant of the threes that I already mentioned. And furthermore, what we see is that also these kind of overweight, dementia, mental health problems are also related to, for example, air pollution and the lack of green space. At the same time, what we see is that the National Health Service is overburdened and costing a lot of money, and they're looking at cost savings then. Furthermore, we have issues like the cost of living. It's for a lot of people difficult to have a decent living with the money they have. Of course, the housing problem, what we have, and then we have climate change. And I kind of argue that all of this is related and that we need to have much more systemic and holistic view and plans for our transport planning. Next. Next. So what we know at the moment, based on a study we did in 1,000 European cities, including in the UK, is there are each year 200,000 deaths as a result of the current air pollution levels in the cities. There are people don't have access to enough green space, and we estimated that there are 43,000 deaths each year because of the lack of green space. We also see that there are health effects related to extreme heat, 20,000 deaths per year, and that 60 million people suffer of noise levels that are actually harmful to health, and it's mainly related to traffic. And now I talk here about mortality. That's kind of the top of the iceberg. Under that, there's a lot of disease related, but you can see that the burden is very high. Next. If you look at a city like Barcelona, about 20% of mortality in the city is premature because what I call suboptimal urban and transport planning. As a result of our very high traffic density, we have high air pollution levels, high noise levels. We have heat island effects. The city center is 4 or 5 degrees hotter because of all the asphalt that's around and the cars that are around. Also, we don't have enough space for green space. There's very little green space in a way. And also people don't have enough physical activity. Next. What we've learned over the years is that there is a strong link between urban design, urban planning, transport behavior, environmental pathways and lifestyle pathways, and mobility and mortality. We know that, if you design and invest in infrastructure for cars, you get a lot of people using the car, which leads to a lot of air pollution, noise, heat island effects, more stress generally, less social contacts, and in particular also less physical activity for people, what leads then to a range of different disease and premature mortality. On the other side, if you invest and design a city for, say, active transportation, like, for example, cycling, you get more people to use bicycles, what's less air pollution, less noise, bicycles takes up less space, so you don't have this heat island effect. Generally, cyclists are less stressed, have more social contact, and in particular have more physical activity, what leads to a reduction in disease and premature mortality. Next. Unfortunately, many decades of car-centric planning have led to this kind of car dependency that we see nowadays in our society, and in particular car dominance in our cities. Unfortunately, the number of cars on the road is still predicted to increase over the years, including in Europe, partly because the main determinant of the prediction and forecasting of cars is GDP. The assumption is that if GDP increases, the number of cars increases. In this way, that's, policymakers start to construct roads for the cars. What then, because construction is an increase in investment, increases GDP, and then we're going to get more cars. So we got here the self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, when people actually have cars, what we see happening is that they live further away from where they work, for example, and there's more building going on to get more sprawl. But sprawl leads to more road building, leads to further investments, leads to a higher GDP. Now, if you're the chancellor, you like a higher GDP, but the question for me is this the kind of GDP we actually want? I believe we need to get away from this kind of predict and provide model that's being used at the moment to decide and provide. So we need to determine what do we actually want before going. So we should also look at further to avoid, shift, and improve our mobility system, what we currently have. Next, please. Now, you can't change that much so quickly in cities, so we need to use our public space that we have better, I think, and we need to look at some novel urban models, what I call. For example, what we have is like the low traffic neighborhoods in London. I know there is a lot of criticism of them, or there was a lot of fuss about them, but they actually work. I mean, it reduces car traffic within these areas, also the air pollution levels, and it increases physical activity. Or what we could do is, use the kind of 50-minute concept, what is being applied in Paris, where within the different areas of in Paris, they introduce more destinations that people actually can go to. Because the idea of the 50-minute city is that people have destinations to go to within 50 minutes of their house, including, for example, their work, school, events, and other shopping, for example. Or we can introduce car-free neighborhoods. And I see now more and more cities that are developing car-free neighborhoods, or where there's a very low density of cars. Here, the example I have is the Vauban in Freiburg. That neighborhood has been existing for a long time. Finally, you've got like a model like the superblock in Barcelona, what was introduced here many years ago. Next, please. The idea of the superblock is that you cut off a couple of junctions in a grid system of streets. We have a grid system here in Barcelona. You cut off 4 junctions, and where you don't allow motorized traffic to go through, but what you only allow is active transportation, and also increase green space. The idea in Barcelona was to introduce 502 superblocks. Unfortunately, only a few have been realized so far. Next one. This is one of them. This is Sant Antoni. On the left side of the picture, you see what it was before, a street in the city with quite a few cars, and then they actually transformed it into this super block with more green space, also a play area for kids. Next one. We estimated, though, that if the 502 super blocks would have been introduced in Barcelona, we could reduce the overall rate of premature mortality by almost 700 deaths per year. Most of the benefits come from a reduction of air pollution, followed by noise, the reduction in heat island effect, and because of the increase in green spaces. We also saw some benefits because of the increase in physical activity, although we underestimated this because we didn't have any data to see how people would actually behave. But you can see by transforming the public space that was there, the road space, into a super block, you can have considerable health benefits. Next one. Also, most of the car journeys that we have nowadays are less than 5 kilometers, and they could be easily replaced by other means, for example, by cycling or some walking or some public transport. Unfortunately, people are nowadays so dependent on the cars and have to spend, on average, about 20–30% of their income on running a car. And that's where I come back to the cost of living crisis, that it's very expensive for people to do this and use this mode of transport, where they actually, because of many years of planning, have to do. Next one. In a study of 167 cities, they found that there was a direct relationship between the availability of cycling lane infrastructure, so kilometers per 100,000 people, and the mode share of cycling. There was almost a linear relationship up to 25% mode share of cycling. Over that, I mean, it actually broke down the relationship. But for me, what is clear is that if you want to get people to cycle, you need to put safe infrastructure there, so people can feel safe and are willing to cycle. A good example of this is the city of Utrecht, where many years ago they started a policy to promote active transportation. And now almost 80% of trips, I think, in the city are actually by bicycle. Next one. Now you think, that's not possible in the UK. But you have to remember that also in the 1970s, the left side of this picture in Amsterdam, it was also full of cars and air pollution. And nowadays, the picture on the right side, you can see what it looks like nowadays. A much nicer area to be in, with a lot of cyclists getting their physical activity and very little air pollution. Next one. Of course, I mean, a lot of the infrastructure is already built, and that's what you're stuck with. But there is still, the intention now to build more in many European countries. And what we should avoid is to build like what we see here on the left side is kind of, single housing that leads to a lot of sprawl, leads to a lot of car dependency, where you can't put in public transport because it's not very cost effective. On the other side, we should also avoid what you see at the bottom right of the picture, there's very high sky rises, what are not very nice actually to live in. And so you need to look at something, the right type of density, where you can actually, people can walk and cycle and use public transport, and you're not dependent on the car. An example for the density is, for me, it's Barcelona. Unfortunately, because they've let in so many cars, it's not the ideal city, but I mean, I think it's got a good density. Next one. So I think we should move away from single housing to actually more apartment living, but make sure that what you build is actually nice to live in and is also sustainable, so that many people people actually would like to live in those places, and it's also climate resilient for the future. Next one. If you want to read a little bit more, I recently wrote an article around this in the Lancet, with climate crisis as a driver for change. So if you want to read more about this, have a look, and I'm also happy to answer questions later on. Thank you so much. Next one. Here is also somewhere my email if you want to email me. And by the way, this is my team who do all the work, of course, and we're just celebrating a paper that was published on the topic.
Ah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really interesting. It did prompt a thought when you were just talking about the sustainable building and building apartments. I live in a village, and a big piece of land recently became available, which is being developed with lots of houses. And you think, well, actually that, it's got the space for it. But I wonder how future looking we are. So if there's the space now to build your traditional houses, it made me think, should we be doing that? Should we not be thinking, okay, well, where are we going to be in 50 years' time? So even non-urban locations,
yeah, of
is
course.
it worth
I think
thinking?
also non-urban locations, I think we need more density, and also that allows for people more to walk. I mean, more mixed land use. I think the problem in the rural locations is that people are so dependent on the car, because there is no public transport, it's too expensive, doesn't come frequent enough. And what we see nowadays in rural locations is that people don't get even less physical activity than people in cities. because they just have to step in the car to go to the shop in the next village or further away. There's no way you can walk or cycle there.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, we need to rethink about this. And I'm also there promoting apartment building.
Great, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation, and we will talk some more later. But I'd like to hand over to Esther now.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm a planner by background and get involved in urban design, and I was asked to talk about development density, so I think it follows on quite well from Mark's talk. I'm going to go into some detail on the concepts of how density is looked at in the planning system. Next slide. So we have sort of three underlying concepts in our planning system at the moment, which we've had for, well, two of them we've had for quite a long time. Compact City, which comes from the Urban Renaissance report about 25 years ago, which is about maxing out or optimising density at transport hubs. One of the ideas of this is to make the transport hubs work well, also to prevent sprawl. So what Mark was saying about, we build higher density where people can get to things, and we don't build low density. At the moment we are doing both, so we'll come back to that. The concept is also about piggybacking on existing infrastructure, whether it's transport or other infrastructure, social infrastructure, and those two go hand in hand and is sort of baked into how we think of planning in this country at the moment. But since COVID, we've been thinking a lot more about living local and reducing the need to travel long distances. So reducing the distance people need to travel, not necessarily the number of trips, and that's partly by bringing things closer together and not having mono-use culture of a suburb or a dormitory where you just sleep and then you have to go somewhere else to work and then you have to go somewhere else to study, etc. So much more mixed use. The next. Well, one of the most probably powerful policies in the planning system at the moment is about the housing targets. So local authorities are all given housing targets and told you've got to meet them, you've got to build them. So you've probably heard in the news, we're now in a target of 1.5 million homes in 5 years, or 4.5 years left. This is a graph showing permanent homes started. It's really quite low. We're nowhere near the numbers that the government wants to promote, but the planning system has got sort of weighted. So you have a housing target. If you don't meet your housing target, or you haven't allocated enough land for the housing target, you're in something called a presumption in favour of development, which means you can't really say no. So you know, if you have a low density greenfield sprawl size proposal that comes forward, if you're not meeting your housing targets, you can't really say no to that, even if you want something better on that site. Next. The way that the planners, the planning system kind of gets itself very tied up in knots, in lots of inquiries and lawyer fees, etc. Around the housing targets, it relates to the way residential density is looked at. So this is a very famous picture here, which came from the Urban Renaissance report, the Urban Design Compendium, and it shows 75 dwellings per hectare that can be delivered in 3 different ways on the same size site. And they all have different impacts in terms of livability, sustainability, and transport impacts. And we do measure density in habitable rooms per hectare, dwellings per hectare, floor space per hectare, and plot ratios, which is the amount of the site that is built on as well. So, or something similar to that. I won't go into it in detail here. So we need figures from residential density that tell us, okay, we've got this many sites, we've got 10 sites and they're this big. What can we assume the density will be on them? Therefore, how many homes are we going to build? Therefore, are we meeting our housing targets? So it goes back to the housing target policy being really prominent in the way planning works in this country. Next. And if you talked to architects, placemakers, designers, urban designers, anyone who cares about the quality of places and quality of life, health, sustainability, livability, you'd say that density should be an output of the design process. So you have lots of requirements that go into how you design a scheme, and you end up with a density that's right for that scheme and its context. But these people, the planning system that's relating so much to housing targets and having to be able to work out how many years worth of supply of land you've got, then density needs to be an input to the design process. It's kind of saying, we've got this site, you have to achieve this density on it, whatever. Next. And this is a 25 2015 version of the Sustainable Residential Quality Density Matrix, which was first put into the London Plan, which is the only strategic plan we have in the country at the moment. The more are coming, so why I'm doing this talk, what this is doing is said it was based on research that's looked at, say, 100 schemes and said, what qualities do these schemes have? Do they meet a standard, quality standards? If they do, what density are they achieving, and what type of place is it? So what's its setting, suburban, urban or central, etc. So some people split into suburban, inner and outer, and rural as well. And then what is its public transport accessibility level? With the concept going back to that compact city approach that says if you're in a more accessible place, you should be of a higher density. So the highest density in this in 2015 in the planning policy, this was planning policy, we were looking at in high PTAL, high accessibility levels in central areas was the absolute, if you've got units which were 2.7 to 3 habitable rooms a unit, could go potentially up to 405 units per hectare. Next. But what we didn't have in that London plan is anything that said, and these are the qualities your scheme needs to have. So it's kind of the brakes on density. These are examples from the National Design Model Design Code document, and there you can see they're sort of saying you have to have junctions of certain types of sizes or gaps between buildings, etc., different layouts of roads in different scenarios in different types of places. And if they are actually strong requirements in policy, they are the input to the density that you get out, if that makes any sense. But we didn't have these in the London plan. Next slide. We just had these idea of the matrix, and what happened, this is a graph showing what decisions in London were made into about just coming up to 2015, and the darker green lines represent schemes that were approved by the GLA which were within the density matrix. So you can see a large number of schemes were either lower than the density matrix requirement as a policy or higher, mainly higher. Next. And this is the type of thing then we were building and are still building, and it's just maxing out density on opportunity areas because there's a station, with the concept that there's a station, so you can put loads of people living there. They don't need anything else. They can get on the train. It doesn't matter how much it costs. It doesn't matter how crowded it is, that they can go and live their life somewhere else. For me, that's bad planning. Next. So I'll try and speed up a bit. So that's where we are with net site densities. That's why we use them. It helps us with our housing delivery tests, and we don't consider capacity of an area, of a neighbourhood, and we're not potentially creating good long-term neighbourhoods. Next. So instead, I'm suggesting that we move towards, in planning terms, a system of gross densities, gross neighbourhood densities, which are less appropriate for housing targets, but they are much better for proper planning. Next. So we know that what we need in life is all of these different scales of places to work at all these different scales. Next. I'm really whizzing through it now because I know I'm up to 8 minutes. And this graph shows sort of how that works in terms of a multi-timed place, multi-time city, not a 15-minute city, because you can't have a city that only works on the neighbourhood. The neighbourhoods have to stitch together to work for civic life and urban life. The bit broader, the longer journeys to the more specific uses that you don't use so often, but loads of people use them, where public transport comes into its own. But you also need that home circle. If we can get the home circle working well, the neighbour spaces, the pocket parks, etc., you have less demand, the local shops, the delivery systems, then you have less demand on longer distance transport, and you can help create better places for people to live better lives. Next. So when we're thinking about, okay, so I've just seen, I've got another couple of minutes, thank you. When we're thinking about neighbourhoods and we're thinking about optimising that gross neighbourhood density, this is kind of traditionally how we think about the movement pattern in a neighbourhood, saying it's 800-metre circle as the crow flies. Next. But we know it's actually about how the footfalls, so that 800-metre circle is not real, it comes down because of barriers, etc., in terms of where you can actually get to. Next. And when we start to think about optimising neighbourhood, gross neighbourhood density, then we can think, well, how do we make that catchment area, that walkable or active travel? It doesn't have to be a walking distance map, but just to get the concept over, how do we make it bigger? How can we get rid of some of the barriers that are there that are stopping movement from happening? Next. And then, so like that, next. And then how do we get more stuff in to that neighbourhood? So we're increasing its gross density without just focusing on individual site net densities, which also are very important to viability, but they're not necessarily about making sure that optimizing the opportunities of this neighbourhood to its carrying capacity, but also its sustainability and its livability. Next. So here's a suggestion for a different met density matrix from the one we saw in the London plan, which actually starts at a strategic level. This would be useful potentially for new strategic plans, which the government's brought forward in its bill recently in the last couple of weeks, where we start to think about different types of neighbourhoods, character areas, because that is important. We have a better accessibility score, and that is coming in London. We've got something called SAM, which is a new combination of public transport and access to local services. Scoring, and that will be coming out hopefully relatively soon. And I understand DfT are working on something as well. And then we can start to fill in what we would expect the gross densities should be for different types of neighbourhood. Next. And at the strategic planning level, we can then start to say, well, which neighbourhoods can we move through investment, through in new infrastructure, through pragmatic planning and proactive planning? Can we move them right on this graph so that we end up increasing the potential for the gross neighbourhood densities, which would increase how much we can deliver in a much more, I think, sustainable and realistic way. Next. And that could be passed down to local plans, and it's the local plans that then do the site allocations and can come up with improvement plans beyond the big ticket transport and other infrastructure plans proposals which need to go into the strategic plans. So you can say, you know, the London plan as an example can say to London boroughs, here's what we want you to achieve as your gross neighbourhood densities for your neighbourhoods, and these are your neighbourhoods and what we want them to be. Now you look at the sites, you look at the opportunities, you look at improving accessibility and mix of uses within those neighbourhoods to meet those gross densities. And that would allow the calculations to still happen for the housing targets, because we're still going to have that. That's my last slide. Thanks very much. Hope that was not too
Yes,
much.
yeah. That was so informative. This is all quite new stuff for me, so I found that incredibly interesting. I guess the question I ask is, it looks like there's so much benefit to doing that work and to actually looking across and actually really thinking about the planning of how could we change what's here? How could we bring new things in? Do you think that local areas would do that over, this site has become free, so let's get kind of applications to develop that site?
Well, that's what I mean. That's a neighbourhood planning process to a certain extent when it works well. So you're looking at any particular neighbourhood and saying, what is good about it? What's bad about it? What opportunities for change are in it? And you do that holistically, looking at land use, development, transport, health, public spaces, etc., services, rather than just looking at housing targets. So what we get at the moment is, and we could talk a little bit more later if you want about the grey belt issue, because that's the biggest opportunity here at the moment, is kind of what we get is piecemeal opportunistic development proposals, which are all about kind of their site getting whatever it can on, and it's understandable because it's about making it viable enough to provide the affordable housing, etc., that it has to pay for. But it's kind of that concept of piggybacking on what it's around. It's not just piggybacking on public transport, it's piggybacking by maxing out the site densities. You are requiring other bits of land to provide the things that your site needs. And we can't, if we plan that way, only plan that way, and think about net site densities, we end up with kind of nowhere to go. And if you look at if you go to some of the new opportunity areas in London, which are super high density, really high, it's surprising that there's no one around. The streets are empty, and it's kind of, there's loads of housing, but there's nothing else. There's nowhere to go, nothing to do. So, you know, if you start to be a more comprehensive approach to planning those areas without it being straitjacketed by the housing targets, which it is at the moment, and that's not going to change. So I'm just suggesting, is this a better way to consider housing targets?
And just one more quick question before we move on. It sounded as if these are lots of objective measures and they would have, you know, a big well-being reaction. But are these mainly objective measures in this planning?
What do you mean by objective?
So things that you can say, right, you have that within a certain distance and you have that within a certain...
You can measure these things. So you can, there was in the early, in about 20 odd years ago, alongside the Urban Renaissance report that said build higher density at stations. It also had a very good graph of what facilities you need within what distances. It's just that that part of that Urban Renaissance approach has got lost over the years. So it has been done, and it can be done, to say what you need. We say how much private open space we need in London. We have a requirement for balconies, for all homes to have balcony or garden, which is not in the rest of the country. But we don't have a requirement to how much neighbour space there is. You know, so we require some things, and we don't require other things, and there's no real logic to it. It's just what's happened in the system.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther. We'll talk more later. I'd like to move on to Hannah.
All right, get the video and the audio on. Thank you very much. So I'm Hannah Budnitz. I'm a researcher at the Transport Studies Unit at the University of Oxford, although I came to academia after a dozen years working as a transport planner here in the UK. Here at Oxford, much of my research has been on electric mobility, including public EV charging, shared electric mobility, and electric mobility policy and governance. However, I've also been asked to talk to you a bit about digital policy, as my PhD work looked at the interactions between digital connectivity, travel behavior, and resilience to extreme weather. Next slide, please. So Mark already mentioned this framework for decarbonizing the transport sector. It's this idea of avoiding travel, or making it possible to avoid travel, shifting to other modes, and improving the energy efficiency of travel. The two areas of policy I've been asked to talk about clearly fall under avoid. So if you can connect remotely, then you don't need to travel, and improve in terms of electrification, although I would argue that it might not be quite so simple to categorize them in that way. But in any case, transport planners and professionals can't ignore digital and energy policy and infrastructure issues if they expect digital connectivity or electrification to decarbonize transport. So it needs to be looked at all together. Next slide, please. So again, kind of referring to other people's work, I don't know if the audience has seen Glenn Lyon's framework for triple access planning for digital connectivity, transport systems, and land use proximity. But even taking out the land use aspect, there's a lot of different interactions between the information and communication technology and transport sectors. And my research at the time didn't go into the kind of intelligent transport system side of things, but rather focused on the interactions between travel and access behavior, including remote access and the infrastructure that enables that, both digital infrastructure and transport infrastructure. So the sort of one side of that diagram. Next slide, please. And I think that a key aspect of my research that I wanted to highlight to this audience, and something that was a bit of a revelation for someone coming from transport planning, is learning that digital infrastructure and connectivity is affected by some of the same issues as transport systems. Digital divides happen in time and space, and they can suffer from congestion too, even if there is perhaps more redundancy in the network. So the map shows download speeds, and the darker areas are where download speeds are faster, and the lighter areas where they're slower. So you can see real urban-rural divide. But there's also kind of digital divides in terms of a lack of skills, what occupation people are in, distance from London, and even during the pandemic, digital connectivity varied widely, as you can see on the graph, which actually shows upload speeds, which became so important for hybrid working and webinars like this. And we clustered places, the country as a whole, by their upload speeds, and you can see how different things are happening in different places. Next slide, please. I also wanted to briefly make the point that even if you address some of those digital divides in terms of the infrastructure, you won't necessarily be making transport more sustainable or addressing the climate emergency. So in some of my research, I looked at travel patterns of telecommuters. And as you can see in this graph, they make more non-commuting trips than those who do have to commute. And these rebound effects may well outweigh any carbon savings from reduced commuting. And some studies that I've seen suggest that they do outweigh those carbon savings, particularly as for telecommuters who travel to work, their distance to work is longer on commuting days. And if it's happening by car, and if those non-commute journeys are happening by car. So digital connectivity and hybrid working and indeed online shopping and things as well can't on their own be a solution to decarbonize transport. And I think the other thing that we often perhaps forget about is that there are also carbon emissions from the buildings where people are carrying out those activities, and the balance of whether or not the carbon emissions in the household that maybe increase if somebody is in the household more often because they're working from home are less than the carbon emissions in the office buildings, and whether those are being reduced or in other types of workplaces. Next slide, please. So that brings me quite neatly onto the other area of policy that I've been asked to talk about, which is electrification. And I think that it would be unwise to look at the switch to electric vehicles as a transport issue only, as it involves a really massive change in terms of household energy use. So although electric vehicles are more efficient in terms of the amount of energy they use compared to fossil fuel powered vehicles, it shifts the burden of provision. So you're not going to a petrol station anymore. The energy is not being provided by oil, generally speaking. It's being provided by the country's electric system. And you can see the graph is showing is from smart meters from a sample of 11 to 12,000 households around the UK. And the top line is EV owners, the daily profile of their energy use, and the bottom line is non-EV owners. And it shows the kind of higher consumption. There is a peak there, which suggests that people maybe have flexible tariffs and are using cheaper, cleaner electricity overnight to charge their EVs, but there's also higher consumption overall. And that might be down to things like the fact that early adopters tend to be wealthier, and wealthier households tend to use more energy generally. Bringing it back to the other topic, so some of there's overlaps as well between those who are adopters of these technologies and those who can telecommute or who are more likely to access activities remotely. Next slide, please. However, a lot of my research has been focusing on households that will not be able to charge from home. And I think going forward, it's really important to consider what behavior patterns that different types of public charging infrastructure, particularly that's put in to serve the people that can't charge from home, might be promoting. So if you're putting charging infrastructure on street, that's causing conflicts with all the other needs for the curbside, what happens along the streets. And it's also suggesting a kind of continuation of giving that space over to parking, but in this case, parking and charging, and putting extra pressure on parking, potentially more congestion, more street furniture. And there's kind of questions around whether or not hubs offer more reliability and redundancy, what can happen in terms of efficient energy use and storage. And what I'm particularly interested in more recently is around sharing charging and sharing the vehicles that are charging, and whether there's opportunities for that, particularly going back to the brief mention of in rural areas where perhaps public transport is not as viable or as much of an option. You can see the graphs actually show that the energy profile from shared cars versus private cars at electric charging hubs in Oxfordshire is quite different as well. And going on to my final slide very quickly, this is why it's so important to consider those interactions between digital and transport infrastructure, as well as energy and transport infrastructure. So the picture that looks like just a car parked in a car park is actually a shared electric vehicle in Utrecht. That's a car club run by a solar energy company. So it's bringing those energy and transport systems together. I'm actually also working with a startup in Banbury that currently runs a shared EV delivery service, but has been talking about their vision of a combined mobility and energy as a service hub and delivery model. And the other picture is at Redbridge Park and Ride in Oxfordshire, where that just shows the EV charging and some solar panels, but there's also a large battery energy storage facility. It's connected to the grid. It can power nearby homes. It also powers electric charging for electric buses in Oxford. And really how important it is, and it's been talked about quite a lot, that when we talk about future mobility, if we're talking about electrification, we should also be talking about shared and add in autonomous as well. So all those sorts of policies need to come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really interesting. So the idea of a telecommuter I thought was really interesting. I hadn't heard that term before. It's a great term. So that's somebody who's working from home but actually using the technology to communicate. I think obviously we as a society had to react to COVID, and it's created lots of opportunities. It's caused lots of change. And I've been kind of thinking, well, you know, all these people working at home, powering their houses, and, you know, all the energy that creates is potentially worse than having centralized and commuting, particularly as you say, because commutes might be longer now on the days that they do travel. Do you think that government or society is reacting appropriately to think about the risks and think about the opportunities of the changes in the way that we work?
I mean, I think that there's been a lot of back and forth, really. I mean, it feels like in the news they're changing their minds on what they think is a good idea all the time. I mean, and it is quite complex because we don't have a lot of data on both the travel and the energy use at home from the same households and the energy use in buildings. So some of it might be how much are workplaces changing how they use energy and what they have on or off, turned on or off, and that sort of thing. So there is that as well. There is obviously other considerations around work-life balance. It's interesting because although there is evidence that people who hybrid work travel longer distances on days when they do go into a central workplace, there's, at least from before the pandemic, there wasn't a real trend towards living a really long distance from work. So it was more like moving from more central areas to more suburban areas. So there's also a lot of kind of questions around relocation. It's not, you know, what causes what? Is it that the longer distance commutes are caused because people can telecommute, or are they trying to telecommute because they have such a long commute that that's all that's going to work for them, and they manage to find an employer who's willing to do that for them? So it's quite a complex issue, and I think that it's something we're still coming to grips with. I think there is evidence as well, though, that a lot depends on what that hybrid working pattern is. So there's a big difference, for example, between people who work from home sort of 3 or 4 days a week and only go into the office once or twice, to people who go into the office all day, every day but one. So there's that as well.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. We will talk more later. Thank you so much for your patience, David. I'd like to hand over to you now to round us off.
Thank you. Can we have the first slide? So I've got a kind of a rather miscellaneous collection of topics to mention, prompted by the request of the organisers. So let's go on to the next slide. Appraisal of transport investments. The conventional approach identifies the main benefit as being travel time savings, but that doesn't conform to the reality of what we see in the real world, where the main benefit of faster travel is increased access to people and places, to employment opportunities, to services, activities, friends and family, and so forth, all of which enhance our quality of life and improve our economic well-being. And to summarize the findings of a number of studies, and I'll give a reference at the very end, those people with the availability of a car in the household or a decent public transport services have quite good levels of access and choice of regularly used destinations. And that leads me to suggest that we are approaching or have reached what one might call travel demand saturation. We have enough daily travel to meet our needs. Now, demand saturation is a common concept in economics, in particular in business economics, but it's not really been thought about in the context of travel. But it does, if one buys the idea, have implications for future investment. But nevertheless, there will be people who will not have enough access to meet their needs. The 25% of households not owning a car, and others with less good public transport. So what can we do for them? But there are limitations on what we can do. And the key one, I think, is that although, as we've been hearing from Esther in particular, there is scope for planning approaches to improving access. Nevertheless, nearly all the trips that people actually make have origins and destinations within the existing built environment that we've inherited, that we couldn't afford to knock down and replace, even if we wanted to, which we don't. And these trips also use the existing transport infrastructure. So this is quite a limitation on our ability to improve access. And the other limitation is the cost of subsidies, particularly for public transport. So what approaches do we then have to enhancing access to desired destinations? Next slide, please. So one is changes to the built environment. And here it's important to remember that we're only adding about 1% of the housing stock each year through new construction, through new build. And while it's important to think how we should do that, and Esther has spelled this out in some very interesting detail, the overall impact is at least year on year quite small. There's also the possibility of repurposing existing buildings, converting, say, redundant offices to residential, where that can be done. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment about new towns and how they, might be developed. The last new town to be built was Milton Keynes, at a time when car ownership and car use were growing, and that was a town built for cars. We wouldn't do that nowadays. We have, I'm sure, much more compact structures, but you do have to think quite carefully about where people who live there will need to travel, for example, for work purposes. And if you want to reduce car use, is this actually feasible while meeting people's needs? Now, historically, the main way of increasing access was through new transport technology, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And I'll also say something briefly about how taxation, grants and subsidies might also increase access. So the next slide, please, thank you. So for almost 200 years, we have relied on transport technologies to increase the speed of travel and improve access. This started in almost 200 years ago in 1830 with the opening of the first passenger railway between Liverpool and Manchester. So the 19th century was the great age of the railways based on coal as a fossil fuel source of energy. In the late 19th century, we had the modern bicycle, which was called, when it was introduced, the safety bicycle, for reasons you can see in the illustration. And that was very important for short journeys, which enabled people to travel faster, therefore further than walking. In the 20th century, the big innovation was the motor car, starting with the mass-produced Model T Ford, which made car ownership available to a large proportion of the population, and also the internal combustion engine supporting use of motorized two-wheelers, still very important in low economy countries, and then the modern jet aircraft, again based on oil fuel. Now, each of these technologies gave a step change increase in the speed of travel, and we took the benefits as increases in access to people and places that transformed our quality of life. However, we run out of ways of going faster with these technologies on the roads, subject to legal speed limits and traffic congestion, which we find it difficult to do anything about. You can't go faster. However, there are new technologies coming along or with us. Next slide, please. 4 important new technologies. One, top left, the electric vehicle, which is important because it reduces carbon emissions and air pollutants, but fundamentally changing the propulsion system doesn't change the characteristics of the vehicle. Bottom left, we have the digital platform creating a market digitally rather than physically. This is the basis of online shopping, of course. And in the transport sector, ride hailing, typified by Uber, has become very popular, a better way of getting a taxi, but it's still a vehicle operating on a generally congested road. Bottom right, digital navigation, otherwise known in the road context as sat-nav, gives us optimized routings. And importantly, the most useful forms give you estimated journey times, because that is really the answer to the main problem with road traffic congestion. When you ask people why congestion is a problem, it's because of the uncertainty of the journey time that bothers them most, and having some prediction of that is quite helpful. And then top right, we have autonomous or automated vehicles being developed with a lot of optimism about their impact. However, none of these new technologies gives you a step change increase in the speed of travel. Therefore, none of them give you an increase in access. The only really important one is the electrification to respond to climate change. The others improve the quality of the journey for those willing to pay the cost of the technology. So we've reached the limit after 200 years of technology to increase access. And that, I think, is something important to recognize. Next slide. So changing tack now, thinking about taxes or charges that increase the cost of car use, which are widely advocated, because one important reason is that you could generate revenue to improve public transport services. And so as examples of this, we have the congestion charge in London, the workplace parking levy so far only in Nottingham, curbside charges levied by local authorities, and possibly in the future, road user charges for electric vehicles, which don't incur any fuel duty. In certainly the three examples mentioned, first three examples mentioned here, the net revenues are ring-fenced to improve public transport services, and that seems to be a desirable policy objective, such that if you increase the cost of car use, you will deprive some people on low incomes from the utility of a car, which is what limits the political feasibility of raising taxes or charges, whether it's fuel duty, which hasn't been raised for a decade, or the reluctance to use congestion charging or road user charging more generally. But on the other hand, by diverting people from cars, you will increase the demand for public transport, which would be a benefit to non-drivers as well as to people who previously drove. Next slide. There's a variety of financial incentives that have operated. One policy objective clearly is to boost the uptake of electric vehicles for both carbon reduction and air quality, and there are government grants for a variety of plug-in vehicles, though no longer for simple plug-in EVs, plug-in cars. But there are important incentives, from taxation incentives, for company cars which are used privately, where the benefit in kind, as it's called, is taxable as income. And there's a big advantage for electric vehicles, which are taxed at 2% of the list price for electric vehicles, contrasted with between 16 and 37% for petrol and diesel vehicles. This incentivizes people who benefit from company cars to choose electric vehicles, which after probably 3 years or so will then move into the second-hand car market, where others can take advantage of these. There's quite a lot of grant money available for public and private electric vehicle charging points, and that's really to solve the chicken and egg problem that people have been reluctant to buy electric vehicles if there's doubts about their ability to recharge either near home or on a journey. In the long run, the supply of electricity for electric vehicles will be a purely commercial matter, but in the near term, public support for doing this to encourage uptake of EVs is well justified. And then there is the zero EV mandate, which is not a financial incentive, it's a regulatory intervention to require car manufacturers to steadily ramp up the proportion of their output that's electric propulsion. And that is probably the strongest pressure to increase EV use. There are lots of grants for cycling facilities, but the point I want to stress about cycling, which is, I think, not necessarily generally appreciated, is increasing cycling doesn't have much impact on car use. It's hard to get people out of cars onto bikes. the evidence is that most of the increase in cycle use comes from people switching from public transport or from walking. And if people switch from public transport, that reduces the fare box income for the operators, and then leads to either reduction in service quality or in requiring more subsidy. So while cycling, in a general way is a good thing environmentally and for health reasons, you do have to be conscious of where the mode switch is coming from. And it's not helpful if it comes from public transport. Let me mention land value capture to help finance urban investments where some of the uplift in land values can be used to finance particularly rail investments. And we've seen this in London with Crossrail, renamed the Elizabeth Line, where a combination of business rate supplement and community infrastructure levy provided some financial support for that major investment. And on a small scale, the extension of the Northern Line to Battersea Power Station, in that case, the developers of the power station surrounding site were very keen to have the underground extended because of the quality of that mode of transport and the volume of people that can be moved, which gave them the greatest uplift of land and property values. And so they were willing to put up about a quarter of the total cost as cash up front. And the Treasury was persuaded to allocate the uplift in business rates for about 20 years to finance the scheme. So such opportunities are probably greatest in London and the southeast, but well worth thinking about as a means for funding new rail investment. And finally, public transport to be reasonably comprehensive does require subsidy out of taxation, but unfortunately that's a limiting factor in terms of respect of what's affordable. So lastly, next slide, please. So my conclusions, which I haven't been able to justify in detail in this short talk. Firstly, that we can treat our transport infrastructure as mature. We have enough infrastructure. We need to focus on maintaining it well and managing it efficiently. We need to recognize that, as I said earlier, nearly all trips take place between origins and destinations within the existing built environment using the existing transport structure, which does limit the scope for interventions to increase access. But nevertheless, there are opportunities to vary the economic incentives to enhance access, particularly for those who have less than they would desire at the moment. Lastly, last slide. So my recent book, Travel Behaviour Reconsidered in an Era of Decarbonisation, was published a few months ago by the UCL Press, an academic publisher of my institution. The UCL Press is an open access publisher, which means you can download a PDF version of this book without charge. So if you've been interested in what I've been saying, or provoked by what I've been saying, and want to see the evidence for my rather sweeping conclusions, then do have a look at a copy and see what you make of it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. I'd like to move straight to panel because I'm conscious we've only got 20 minutes left. So I think I will start with a question. Thank you everybody for putting questions in the Q&A. I think I'll start with a question that links back to the first two sessions where we could see lots of fantastic things going on locally. But the lack of sharing of data, the lack of connection between different schemes was potentially a bit of a barrier. It's a slightly leading question, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. Do the panel agree that the lack of a national spatial strategy for growth and development is holding back the delivery of high quality, highly sustainable homes, workplaces and services. I think I'll just open it up. David, did you want to say something, or was that just you switching on your camera? I'll just open up the question, this one, to anyone who would like to answer.
Is it worth thinking about the fact that the government's now promoting strategic planning, which we haven't had for 15 years? So I think that relates back to that question. So the planning and infrastructure bill that was out 2 weeks ago, I think it was, sets the scene for a new set of strategic plans and changing the way local authority work together. So there used to be regional development strategies that did this, but they got rid of because of political reasons, because they're promoting housing growth in places that people didn't want the housing growth. And the same thing will happen again. But you need the strategic planning to be able to understand the spatial dynamics of big scale infrastructure delivery and growth. And we haven't had a plan for England or regional planning for so long that we're not doing that. You can't do it just at the local level. So it's coming back, but we don't know the details of how.
Oh, okay, right. And how do you feel? Do you feel optimistic about that?
It depends how it's set up, and I don't feel particularly optimistic of planning at the moment, the way planning is, but we desperately need it. So it's better that we're doing it, and hopefully it will be done well, rather than that we don't have it. If it just focuses on housing numbers, we'll be in the same problem that we are now. And I think Mark, was it Mark? Somebody explained earlier in the day how important that is to GDP growth, and therefore that's why politicians like it. But it's not the way places work, or the way you can create longevity in success.
So that was something that was really interesting in your presentation, that a local authority, if they have a planning application, even if it's not quite right for the area or not what might be termed the ideal, they have to go with it to meet targets.
The presumption in favour of sustainable development, it's part of, it's an interesting one because it's just been changed in December actually. So what happens is, sorry if it was, this local authority, you're told you're going to deliver 100 homes. You tell us in your local plan, where's the land for those 100 homes? You can't find it. You can only find land for 50 homes. Right, you're in what's called the tilted balance. So there is a presumption in favour of giving permission to any scheme that comes in. And that has been there for quite a long time now. And that's why we get piecemeal things built everywhere. And this government's just changed it to say that presumption is there, but the scheme has to be sustainably located. It also has to have enough affordable housing and be well designed. But we do not know what sustainably located means at the moment.
Right.
And that's the same thing with the grey belt consideration. So there could be hundreds of thousands of new development in the grey belt, and it is an opportunity where there isn't existing buildings and infrastructure necessarily to use, but we do not know what sustainably located means. And that's the biggest question. If that's sorted and that goes into strategic planning, then we might be on the right track.
Yeah, thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to come in on that question? Yeah, David?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a planning expert, but my impression is that in London, in Scotland, and in Wales, it's been possible to relate changes to the built environment to the available transport system, but not in the rest of England.
That's right. We've got the London plan and the Welsh plan and the Scottish plan. But we don't have an England plan.
In any case, it would be hard to do it for the whole of England, because that would mean taking a national view as to where development should arise. But then if you focus on placing responsibility on individual local authorities to respond to housing need, then you don't have a connection, a necessary connection to the transport infrastructure provision.
So in London it works, so you do have that connection because it's filtered down and tells the boroughs. So there will be a set of new regional strategic planning policy plans for England. It's not one plan, but there'll be a set of them.
Okay.
Mark, I don't know if you're still there. You had some really interesting examples from overseas. I wonder if you've got any understanding of how things might be done in some of our European friends that we could learn from?
Well, not as much. I mean, that's what I said. I'm not a planner, but
No, your health, yes.
I come from a health perspective.
Yes.
But, you know, I see some different developments. I mean, I was in Utrecht in the Netherlands, where they're trying to build or plan a new neighborhood for 50,000 people. I mean, and I thought there it was very interesting is the allocators in space, but they then bring lots of people from different sites together, including my colleagues from public health. And I think, I don't know to what extent that if that occurs also in the UK, if public health people are right in there from the beginning. But I thought this was a nice development. And also there in this new neighborhood, I mean, it's very much the emphasis is on public and active transport, making sure that there are good public transport links to the center and reduce the car use. Because, you know, the problem I think with car use, I mean, of course, it's convenient. If you have the money, it's great. But a lot of, it's what I said before. It's very expensive to run a car, first of all. Also, you exclude quite a large part of the population that actually can't drive. And then also the car takes up so much space, I think, that we forget, the roads are our public space and we can use that in a much better way, in a way. And so also when you see the new developments, just roads built in, just automatically. Oh, we need to have roads, we need to have cars. I mean, and that takes up so much space that you can use in a much better way, much more interesting. And I see some of the, new car-free developments. I mean, of course, there is some access to cars, but it's more on the side of the neighborhoods. And I think that's important. I mean, that just to rethink a little bit, what do we do with our public space? I mean, that don't make it only about mobility or transport, but, it's our public space, but also think about our health. That's what I started off with. We have a big crisis. I mean, so many people are now overweight, obese. I mean, they have no opportunity to do physical activity. I mean, they sit in their home, watch the screen, watch TV, step in the car, drive to work, sit at the screen, and drive back again. I mean, and that's crazy.
Yeah, actually, that was another question somebody raised. That again, I'll open this to everybody about how do we get past the developers having drive per house. So how do we overcome that? Right, if you do a house, it has to have a drive, and actually, in places too, parking for at least 2 vehicles. How can we overcome that? Anyone?
I can come back in on the planning side unless anyone wants to say. So we moved from minimum car parking standards to maximum car parking standards as policy about 25 years ago. And we know that you can have local policy that says you can only have on-street parking, unallocated on-street parking, which is the most efficient type, or you can have it in parking courts or parking barns, etc. But the developers will say they can't sell the homes if they haven't got on-plot parking. But places like Nottingham have been really successful at pushing back against that through using a supplementary planning document which sets out exactly what you can and can't do. But the local authority has to be strong enough and get the work with the highway authority, because often the planning authority and the highway authority are two different bodies, and the highway authority's purpose is the free and good, safe movement of people and goods. It's not about placemaking or health or anything. So they will be looking to make sure that the cars are not causing obstruction. So they might be pushing for on-plot, while the planning officer is pushing for not on-plot. But that's the way you can start to raise the density. I was going to bring in the whole example of Cambridge, actually, in case it's useful. So Cambridge decided strategically 25 years ago to plan where they're going. These are the bits of the existing countryside or greenbelt that we're going to build on. And we're going to choose those ones because they tie in best to the existing city. But also we can put in strategic transport infrastructure, either a guided bus route or a park and ride a bus facility, which will serve new residents and people coming to the city for shopping, etc. So you've got a number of park and rides and a number of guided bus routes, and then the cycle infrastructure. And they combine that with higher density housing. So instead of the stuff that the house builders will build normally is about 25 dwellings per hectare. In Cambridge, it goes up to about 70 with different types of housing. Definitely different, very clearly defined different approaches to car parking, and promoting the use of shared amenity space rather than lots of small gardens. And that just makes for really successful neighbourhoods. And they also have ensured there's mixed use. So, you know, the things we've been talking about today, Cambridge, if you go to Eddington or Great Knighton or places like that, they are new settlements that are like this. They have achieved it. So it's kind of lots of lessons learned there.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've only got time for one last question. Oh, sorry, Hannah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this points about parking and the amount of space it takes up, because I do feel that this is where it is really important to consider that if the vehicle fleet is going to be electric, whatever size it's going to be, this is an opportunity to be thinking about where it's put and those connections. And the fact that you know, there's aspects of energy planning and how can you get the connections for the electricity to the vehicles. And if we can join up these ideas and these policies and actually think about, okay, where is going to be more resilient? Where can we actually maybe release some space from parking and encourage sharing as well? And where is it going to be more of a community asset? Because again, it's not the same as refueling a vehicle for most people. And that's not going to change, even with this idea that they're going to have electric vehicles that you can plug in and charge in the same amount of time. At least at the moment, the technology means that degrades the battery a lot faster. You don't want to be doing that all the time. And also, a lot of the benefit that people see when they do switch to electric is being able to combine it with a different activity. So you want, whether it's sleeping, because you can plug in at home, but also workplaces where people spend time. So how can we think about it creatively to make that switch be part of our land use planning and part of our parking strategies and the rest of it?
How do you see that working, Hannah, behaviourally? So you had some really interesting examples. You had an interesting example of startup and kind of, you know, the sharing of EV. That sounds like it's asking people to behave in a very different way. Have you done much work around people's response to this?
I mean, I think that it is asking people to behave in a different way. And I'm actually about to start a research project looking at sharing in rural communities, because they tend to be quite understudied, and it's obviously a different scenario than where you have public transport and lots of amenities and employment close by and all these other options in cities. But I think one thing that was quite interesting from a piece of research that I did on EV charging in Oxfordshire was we interviewed a lot of people that were already EV owners, and we found that even the ones that are parking outside their home are much happier with switching to an EV if they've changed other aspects of what they do. So if they just are parking it on the drive and still having to and don't have a charger, don't have solar panels, haven't changed when, you know, thought about when to park, when to optimize their charging times and the cost of that, they're less happy with that experience. And there was also an element where we found that there was a lot of interaction between neighbors. So early adopters get a lot of attention. People want to know what they're doing, whether they're parking on the street or at a workplace or what have you. And so I think that there's a real opportunity there to harness that kind of community aspect of it and see, can we go further with sharing, with behavior change, kind of a bit more bottom up as opposed to sort of top down things that people don't necessarily react to.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just go back to this last quick question, I think now. I will ask it to you, Mark, because it is about health. Health in all policies is, oh, sorry, it's just moved. I was just reading off my screen and somebody put something in below. Health in all policies is an approach to embedding health considerations across local and national government. What does the panel know about how they are used in practice in UK and beyond? So I will start with you on this one, please, Mark.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important concept that's proposed by the World Health Organization, and in a way it should. I mean, our health is very important, so we should think about, you know, what our actions, what do they do to our health? I mean, I'm saying for myself, I'm a public health professional. I mean, I can see what are the health impacts. Actually, I can't make the difference. I mean, I've got the least influence on what actually can be done. The people that actually can make an impact, a large impact on health, are urban planners, are transport planners, and all those people around that actually can make the changes, have the money to make a much healthier and sustainable system and development, I think. And that's why it's so important to, bring health into your thinking. And that's why I mentioned Utrecht before, where the public health officials sitting into the task force saying what are you going to do? This can be help for health. This doesn't help health. So this promotes health. This doesn't. And so I hope that everyone, if you're a transport planner, a transport professional, if you're an urban planner, please think about health. Look at what the World Health Organization proposes. And they've got some nice documentation also how you could include health thinking into your work.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. I'm afraid we're going to have to round off now. Thank you all so much for your time this morning. There were fantastic presentations, really interesting discussion. I'll just go around the panelists just quickly just to see if you've got any final comments you want to make. Should we start with you, Esther? Just any final summing up?
Thank you. It's been very interesting.
Okay, thank you so much. Move on to Hannah. Any final comments?
Just that I think that the idea of integrating different policy sectors is really, really important, different infrastructures, and even within transport, different modes, because it's just so easy to get stuck in your silos and we're not going to solve problems that way.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Brilliant. Mark?
Yes, I agree with that. We need more systemic and holistic thinking, I think. Bring different people together. That's the only way how we can improve things. I think we're working still too much in silos.
Yeah, just something I've taken from all of you is people's behavior and people's attitudes need to change, not just individually, but as a community. I think we've got quite used to thinking about individuals, family units, and it doesn't sound as if that is going to work with some of the things that you've been talking about. So yeah, I'll move to you, David. Any final comments or observations?
Yes, the car is problematic for reasons that we've rehearsed at some length, and I don't disagree with any of that. But I think we need to recognise the popularity of the car as a means from getting A to B, where congestion is not too serious and where you can park at both ends of the journey. And we also should recognise that many people probably most like cars, like to own cars, and appreciate them as a consumer item. And so if we want to change behaviour, we've really got to face up to this. And I think this is going to be a limiting factor. My own view is to deal with the problems associated with the car, rather than push back on car ownership and use, which is pushing uphill, you need to tackle the particular problems like tailpipe emissions, which you do by switching to electrification, like deaths and injuries, which you can deal with by 20-mile-an-hour zones, and so forth. So my point is that we need to appreciate the popularity of the car amongst the general
I must say we need to be a bit careful with this, because we normalize the car so much, and it's a great because of the advertising industry. It's so powerful. How the car is advertised, how it's promoted. And people forgotten about it, that you can actually live without a car. You can do things without a car. There is life without a car. Of course, if you look at the TV, you look at the advertising, it's all about the freedom, what you get, having your car, driving around in some wonderful green space, no congestion. Of course, reality is different.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of people, because of the car-centric planning that we've had, have to have a car. It's not that they want it. It's a pain in the neck to have a car for a lot of people. But they have to have it. Because, there is no alternative. And then we have to face that as well. And that's because we've been investing so much money into the car infrastructure. If we start changing our investment, put a bit more into other forms, I think we would be doing much better.
But I think it's a whole new debate to have here at some
I'd
point.
love to have it.
We can't have this debate with just 1 minute left, I'm afraid, but lots of people agreeing with you there. Thank you all so much. I'm really sorry about the technical issues that we had with Sarah earlier. I'm very pleased to say that we're going to record her session and we'll add it on seamlessly in the final thing. That will be available for people to view if they haven't been able to catch the session. Thank you, panelists. You were all incredibly interesting. I've learned a lot. It was a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Landor. Thank you, Sister, for sponsoring, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.